The Manton. Nobody remembered. A man sits in darkness, abandoned by hope itself. Everyone believed his story had ended, that nothing remained except empty years behind concrete walls. But what happened when divine timing collided with human crisis? Get ready for a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about redemption and purpose. If you're searching for proof that no one is beyond transformation, hit that subscribe button. This journey will shake your understanding of second chances. Marcus Webb had occupied cell D47 for 7 years, 3 months, and 14 days. The numbers carved themselves into his consciousness like prisoner marks on stone walls. Each morning arrived identical to the last, a monotonous rhythm of bells, bars, and institutional gray that reduced human beings to processing units in a correctional machine. Guard Davis walked past Marcus's cell every evening at 8:47 p.m., his boots creating predictable echoes against polished concrete. Tonight, however, Davis paused at the bars, his weathered face bearing an expression Marcus couldn't immediately decipher. Not contempt, not indifference. Something darker, perhaps pity mixed with philosophical resignation. "Still reading that Bible, Webb?" Davis asked, gesturing toward the worn leather volume resting on Marcus's narrow bunk. "Seems like wasted effort to me." Marcus looked up from his position at the small metal desk where he'd been writing letters to a nephew who never responded. His hands, calloused from 7 years of laundry detail, folded carefully over the unfinished correspondence. "It provides perspective," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the measured quality of someone who'd learned to control every inflection. Davis leaned against the cell bars with practiced casualness, his keys jangling softly. Perspective. He tested the word like something unfamiliar. "You know what I think, Webb? I think God forgot about you. Forgot about everyone in here, actually. Otherwise, why would good people suffer while scum walks free?" The theological challenge hung in the stale prison air. Marcus had heard variations of this philosophy before, from inmates, guards, even from his own exhausted mind during the darkest nights. The question of divine justice versus observable reality created a chasm that swallowed faith whole. "Maybe God's memory works differently than ours," Marcus offered, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. 7 years of unanswered prayers had taught him caution about defending cosmic benevolence. Davis snorted, a sound devoid of humor. "Sure, different memory, different timeline, different everything." He pushed away from the bars. "Keep reading if it helps you sleep, Webb. But don't expect rescue from something that's already forgotten your name." The guard continued his rounds, leaving Marcus alone with the accusation. God had forgotten him. The statement shouldn't have carried weight. Davis possessed no theological credentials, no spiritual authority. Yet something about the declaration's casual certainty lodged itself beneath Marcus's carefully constructed acceptance. He returned to his letter, but the words refused to flow. Outside his cell window, darkness gathered over the prison yard, and somewhere in the building's mechanical heart, something began to burn, the smell of smoke. When everything you know suddenly transforms into chaos, character reveals itself in seconds. One man faced a choice that would define not just his future, but the lives of everyone trapped in that burning building. What decision would you make when survival instinct battles against moral obligation? Keep reading. And don't forget to share this story with someone who needs to hear about courage under fire. The smoke arrived as a whisper, barely perceptible wisps that might have been dismissed as steam from distant showers or exhaust from kitchen ventilation. Marcus noticed it at 9:23 p.m., precisely 36 minutes after Davis's philosophical assault on divine memory. At first, he questioned his own perception. 7 years of imprisonment taught a man to doubt his senses, to second-guess the reliability of information filtered through institutional routine and psychological exhaustion. But the acrid scent, strengthening with each breath, confirmed something fundamental had shifted in the prison's carefully controlled environment. Other inmates noticed simultaneously. Cell doors remained locked for the night, standard protocol until 6 a.m. count. But the growing haze transforming corridor lights into amber halos created murmurs of concern that rippled through D-Block like seismic tremors before an earthquake. "Yo, Webb!" The voice belonged to Jackson, whose cell stood 3 doors down. "You smelling that?" "Yeah," Marcus responded, moving toward his cell bars. The smoke thickened visibly now, rolling along the ceiling in patterns that had suggested something burning in the lower levels. Something's wrong. The understatement barely captured the situation's gravity. Prisons operated on rigid schedules and predetermined responses. Any deviation triggered immediate protocol activation. Yet 5 minutes into obvious smoke accumulation, no alarm sounded. No guards appeared. No emergency announcements crackled through speakers. Marcus's mind cataloged possibilities with a systematic analysis he'd developed through years of observing institutional patterns. Fire in the laundry facility, electrical malfunction in administrative offices, kitchen equipment failure. Each scenario carried different implications for D Block's location on the building's third floor. Where are the guards? Jackson's question voiced the collective anxiety building throughout the cell block. His tone contained an edge Marcus recognized, the particular panic that emerged when institutional authority suddenly vanished, leaving inmates suspended in uncertainty without guidance or control. Marcus pressed his face against the bars, trying to see down the corridor toward the guard station positioned at the block's entrance. Emergency lighting flickered on, bathing everything in red-tinted shadows that made the thickening smoke appear almost solid. But the station stood empty, chairs abandoned, monitors displaying static. The small television usually showing evening news broadcasting nothing but snow. The prison's alarm system finally activated at 9:31 p.m., its piercing wail confirming what everyone already understood. But the sound brought no relief, only clarification that the situation had escalated beyond routine management. Somewhere below, Marcus heard shouting, not the controlled commands of guards executing emergency procedures, but raw human terror. The building groaned, its infrastructure responding to heat and pressure in ways that transformed familiar architecture into something unstable and threatening. They left us! Someone screamed from the lower tier. They locked us in and left. The accusation spread like the smoke itself, swift, pervasive, suffocating. Marcus understood the psychology driving such conclusions. Inmates lived with fundamental vulnerability, their survival completely dependent on systems that viewed them as problems requiring containment rather than humans deserving protection. But abandonment seemed unlikely. Despite Davis's cynicism about divine memory, institutional liability ensured certain baseline protections. Guards might forget an inmate's humanity, but administrators never forgot lawsuit exposure. Something else was happening, something that had disabled normal evacuation protocols and left D Block's occupants trapped in cells while fire consumed the building around them. Marcus returned to his bunk and retrieved the Bible Davis had mocked. Not for prayer, though perhaps that would come, but for the photograph marking his place in Proverbs. His nephew at age 7 smiling at a birthday party that seemed to belong to a different universe. If these were final moments, Marcus wanted that face to be the last thing he saw, the keys that changed everything. In life's most desperate moments, opportunity disguises itself as chaos. One man discovered that the path to salvation often requires walking through smoke toward danger rather than away from it. What would you risk to save strangers who had never shown you kindness? Stay with this story. The transformation is just beginning, and I promise the next chapter will leave you breathless. The smoke thickened with terrifying speed, transforming D Block from a controlled environment into a concrete trap. Marcus calculated oxygen depletion rates against fire progression, knowledge acquired from a previous life as a maintenance supervisor, skills that seemed irrelevant until this precise moment when survival demanded every fragment of useful information. At 9:38 p.m., through the haze, Marcus saw movement near the abandoned guard station. Not the confident stride of officers executing evacuation protocols, but something desperate and stumbling. A figure emerged from the smoke-filled corridor, Guard Davis, his uniform torn, face blackened with soot, blood streaming from a gash above his left eye. Davis collapsed against the station's desk, his breathing labored. In the emergency lighting's red glow, Marcus watched him fumble for something. Keys. The massive ring containing master access to D Block's 47 cells. Davis! Marcus's voice cut through the cacophony of inmates shouting, alarms wailing, and the building's ominous groaning. Davis, you have to open the cells. The guard's head turned toward Marcus's voice with painful slowness. His eyes struggled to focus, pupils dilated from what Marcus recognized as shock. Whatever had happened below, whatever had injured Davis and scattered the guard force, had damaged more than just the prison's infrastructure. Can't, Davis wheezed, his hand falling away from the keys. System, computer locks, fire damaged. Marcus understood immediately. Modern prisons operated on electronic security systems. Individual cell doors required computer authorization to open. Manual override existed, but only for emergency situations when electronic systems failed, which they had, spectacularly. The keys, Davis, Marcus pressed, keeping his voice steady despite the smoke burning his throat. Manual override, you can unlock us. Davis's laugh emerged wet and broken. Yeah, let everyone out, so they can trample me on their way to freedom. The cynicism wasn't entirely unjustified. Institutional violence remained a constant threat in any prison population. Guards maintained control through locks, protocols, and the understanding that inmates needed their compliance to survive. Remove those barriers during crisis and chaos seemed inevitable. But Marcus saw what Davis's compromised cognition missed. The building was killing them all with democratic efficiency. Institutional roles meant nothing to fire and smoke. Guard, inmate, administrator, everyone became equally vulnerable when oxygen disappeared and flames consumed structural integrity. Listen to me, Marcus said, forcing absolute certainty into his tone. You're injured. You can't evacuate us alone, but I can help. Give me the keys. I'll get people out safely. Help! Davis coughed violently, crimson spattering his hand. You're a convict. Why would you help? The question contained depths Davis didn't intend. Why would Marcus Webb, abandoned by divine memory according to the same guard's earlier declaration, risk anything for a system that had contained him for 7 years? Why extend assistance to a man who'd mocked his faith 36 minutes before everything changed? Marcus had no philosophical answer, only instinct that transcended rational calculation. Because that's what you do when people need help. You help them. The simplicity seemed to penetrate Davis's shock-clouded thinking. His hand moved toward the key ring with agonizing slowness, fingers trembling from blood loss or fear, or both. The keys scraped against metal as he tried to lift them, but his grip failed. The ring clattered against the floor, sliding across polished concrete toward the bars of cell D-47. Inches away, close enough that Marcus could see individual key shapes through the smoke, too far to reach from inside the locked cell. Davis, Marcus said urgently, push them toward me. Just slide them over. The guard stared at the keys as if seeing them for the first time. His breathing had become irregular, short gasps that suggested pulmonary damage from smoke inhalation. Time compressed into critical seconds. The building groaned again, and somewhere below, something massive collapsed with a sound like thunder in an enclosed space. Davis's hand moved, slowly, deliberately, his fingers connected with the keyring and pushed. The metal scraped across concrete, moving inch by painful inch until it stopped at the base of Marcus's cell bars. Marcus dropped to his knees, extending his arm through the bar's lower gap. His shoulder pressed against steel, his fingers stretched. The keys remained just beyond reach. Through the bars. Sometimes salvation exists just beyond our fingertips, requiring us to stretch further than seems humanly possible. One man discovered that limits are often illusions we create through fear of pain. What boundaries have you accepted without testing their true dimensions? Keep reading. This chapter reveals how desperation births innovation. The gap between Marcus's extended fingers in the key ring measured approximately 2 inches. In ordinary circumstances, such a distance meant nothing. The space between intention and completion in daily tasks performed without conscious thought. But pressed against cold steel bars, with smoke stealing oxygen from the air, those 2 inches represented the difference between 47 locked inmates burning alive and the possibility of survival. Marcus adjusted his position, lying flat against the concrete floor. The surface retained a chill that penetrated his prison-issue shirt, but he barely registered the discomfort. His focus narrowed to absolute precision, angle of arm, flexibility of shoulder, positioning a body against the bar's immovable constraint. He extended again. His fingertips brushed the keyring's edge. Not enough to grasp, just enough to confirm physical possibility existed within a narrower margin than previously calculated. "Come on, Webb!" Jackson's voice carried desperation. The smoke had dropped lower, filling cells from ceiling toward floor in an inexorable descent that transformed breathing into conscious effort. "We're running out of time." Marcus understood the timeline with crystal clarity. Smoke inhalation would incapacitate them before flames reached D block. The fire didn't need to consume the third floor directly. It merely needed to fill the air with toxic gases that rendered escape impossible even with open cell doors. He withdrew his arm, assessing the problem from a different angle. The bar's spacing followed federal regulations designed to prevent precisely what he was attempting, reaching through gaps to access anything beyond the cell's confines. Engineers had calculated dimensions to defeat even the most determined efforts. But engineers had worked with averages, standard measurements for average human anatomies. Marcus possessed unusually narrow shoulders, a genetic inheritance from his mother's side that had seemed irrelevant until this moment when survival required fitting into spaces not designed for human passage. He removed his shirt, the fabric's removal eliminating friction that added critical fractions to his body's dimensions. The concrete floor felt colder against his bare skin, but cold meant nothing compared to the heat building from below. He repositioned, angling his shoulder at what felt like the maximum rotation his joint could tolerate without dislocation. "What's he doing?" someone shouted from an adjacent cell. "Whatever it takes," another voice responded, and Marcus recognized Thompson, a lifer who'd occupied D block longer than anyone else. "Give him space to work." The phrase struck Marcus as oddly poignant, giving space in an environment defined entirely by spatial limitation. But he understood Thompson's meaning. The other inmates had quieted their demands, creating psychological space even if physical space remained constrained by architecture and circumstance. Marcus pushed his shoulder through the bars. Pain flared immediately, not the sharp agony of tissue tearing, but the deep ache of bones and joints stressed beyond normal tolerance. His clavicle pressed against steel with force that promised bruising, possibly fracture. He continued anyway, using controlled breathing to manage the discomfort. His shoulder cleared the bar's plane. Now his upper arm pushed through, skin scraping against metal that 7 years of maintenance had kept smooth but not frictionless. He felt warmth, blood from abrasions mixing with sweat and soot coating his skin. Forward, another inch. His elbow joint approached the bars now, and this represented the critical test. Elbows bent in only one direction. Forcing them through narrow gaps required precise angle maintenance and willingness to accept damage over failure. The keyring lay just ahead, visible through the haze. Marcus extended his hand, fingers reaching into smoke-filled space beyond the bars. His muscles trembled from sustained tension. The position was fundamentally unsustainable. Human anatomy protesting treatment that violated its design parameters. His middle finger touched metal, not the keys themselves, but the ring holding them together. He couldn't grasp it, couldn't curl his fingers around it with enough security to pull back. But he could hook it. One finger through the ring's center, using the key's collective weight as the anchor against withdrawal. Marcus began pulling back, slowly reversing the painful process that had gotten him this far. The keys dragged across concrete with a scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud above the alarms and distant shouting. His elbow caught against the bars, and fresh pain shot through his arm. He adjusted angle, sacrificing skin to maintain the hook, keeping keys connected to his retreating hand. Inch by inch, he withdrew. The keys came with him, sliding across concrete, through the narrow gap, into his cell. He grasped them properly now, his full hand wrapping around metal shapes that represented salvation for everyone trapped in D block. The choice power arrives in unexpected moments, placing impossible decisions in ordinary hands. One man held keys to freedom, but faced a choice that would define his character forever. Save himself first, or risk everything for others who had never shown him mercy. What would you choose when self-preservation battles moral obligation? Subscribe and keep reading. This decision changes everything. Marcus struggled to his feet, keys clutched in his blood-slicked hand. His shoulder throbbed from the contortion required to retrieve them, and his lungs burned with each smoke-filled breath. The emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red and shadow, transforming D-Block into a hellscape that matched the fire-consuming floors below. He could open his own cell first. The thought arrived with absolute clarity, carrying no moral judgment, simply logical assessment of available options. Unlock cell D47, navigate through smoke to the emergency exit at the corridor's far end, leave the building before structural collapse or oxygen depletion made escape impossible. Survival, the most fundamental imperative wired into human neurology. The keys felt heavy in his hand, heavier than metal and design should account for. Each key represented a lock, a cell, a human life continuing or ending based on choices made in the next few minutes. Webb! Thompson's voice cut through the chaos. Start with the cells closest to the exit. Work backward. Give people the best chance. The strategy made tactical sense. Unlock cells furthest from danger first, allowing those inmates to evacuate while Marcus continued opening additional cells. Maximum efficiency. Maximum lives saved. The approach contained cold mathematical logic that prioritized collective survival over individual preference. But it also meant Marcus would open his own cell last, would navigate the entire block while smoke thickened and fire climbed, would place himself at maximum risk to provide others with minimum danger. Through the haze, Marcus saw Davis slumped against the guard station, his breathing shallow. The guard who'd declared God had forgotten Marcus, now depended on that same forgotten man for survival. The irony seemed almost literary in its precision, the kind of poetic justice that existed in stories but rarely in life's messier reality. Except life had delivered exactly such a moment. The universe, or divine memory, or random chance, had placed these keys in Marcus's hands, had created circumstances where his choices rippled outward with consequence that transcended personal destiny. Marcus moved toward his cell door. His hand trembled as he sorted through keys, searching for the master that would unlock his specific cell. The metal felt slick with his own blood. Around him, inmates shouted encouragement, demands, prayers. The noise compressed into white static in his smoke-damaged hearing. The key slid into his cell's lock. One turn, the mechanism clicked. 7 years of confinement ending in a single mechanical action. The door swung open on well-maintained hinges. Marcus stepped out of cell D47 into the corridor. Freedom lay 20 yards ahead, the emergency exit glowing with its backup power supply, promising fresh air and safety beyond D-Block's compromised structure. His legs wanted to run toward that light. Every survival instinct screamed for immediate evacuation. Instead, Marcus turned away from the exit, moved towards cell D-1 at the corridor's opposite end. His hands sorted through keys with practiced efficiency, identifying the master override that would open every cell simultaneously in an emergency situation. "What are you doing?" Jackson screamed. "Open the cells! We're dying in here." "That's what I'm doing," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. His fingers found the master key, slightly larger than the others, marked with red tape for emergency identification. "But we do this right. We evacuate organized, not panicked." The statement seemed absurd, given the circumstances. Organization belonged to routine operations, not crisis situations where fire consumed structural integrity and smoke poisoned air. But Marcus understood crowd dynamics from his previous life, managing facility evacuations during fire drills. Panic killed as efficiently as flames. 47 inmates rushing simultaneously toward a single exit created compression, confusion, casualties. He reached the master control panel located near the guard station, where Davis had collapsed. The guard's eyes tracked Marcus's movement with dimming awareness. Blood pooled beneath his body, suggesting internal injuries beyond the visible gash on his forehead. Don't let them." Davis wheezed, unable to complete the thought. Marcus understood anyway. Don't let them hurt you. Don't let them trample you in their rush for freedom. The warning carried resignation, Davis accepting his own helplessness while cautioning Marcus about the violence that might follow releasing inmates from their locked cells. "Nobody's getting hurt," Marcus said, though he possessed no authority to guarantee such promises. He inserted the master key into the control panel's override mechanism. We're all getting out, including you. The panel's design required simultaneous key turn and button press, a safety feature preventing accidental mass release. Marcus positioned himself, counting down internally. 3, 2, 1. He turned the key and pressed the button. Throughout D-Block, 47 cell doors clicked open simultaneously. The sound echoed like rifle shots in the smoke-filled corridor. For one suspended moment, nothing happened. Then cell doors began swinging outward, and inmates emerged into freedom. Order from chaos. When restraints disappear, human nature faces its ultimate test. One man stood between chaos and salvation, armed with nothing but moral authority and desperate hope. Could words control panic when instinct screamed for survival? Keep reading and hit that notification bell, because what happens next defies every expectation about human nature under pressure. The inmates emerged from their cells in a confused surge of humanity, their faces masks of fear, relief, and disorientation. The smoke transformed everyone into shadowy figures moving through red-tinted haze, guards and prisoners indistinguishable except for the blue uniforms some wore. Democracy of disaster had arrived, rendering institutional hierarchies temporarily meaningless. Marcus stood at the corridor's center, keys still clutched in one hand. His position placed him directly between the growing crowd and the emergency exit they needed to reach. A strategic placement that was also potentially suicidal. 47 men desperate for survival could easily trample anyone blocking their path to safety. Listen! Marcus's voice cut through the rising chaos with unexpected force. 7 years of institutional silence had given way to command presence drawn from his previous life managing construction crews. We evacuate in order. Nobody runs. Nobody pushes. We all get out and alive, but only if we stay controlled. Someone laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. You giving orders now, Webb? Since when do you run things? Since I have these, Marcus held up the keys, the metal catching emergency lighting. Since I opened your cells while I could have saved just myself. So yeah, right now I'm running things. And here's how this works. He gestured toward the emergency exit. Cells 1 through 10, you go first. Walk, don't run. When you reach the stairwell, stay to the right. Let emergency personnel coming up stay left. Clear? The inmates from cells 1 through 10 hesitated, seemingly stunned by the concept of orderly evacuation during crisis. Then Mitchell, a quieter inmate who'd kept to himself during his incarceration, nodded and began walking toward the exit. Others followed his lead, their pace controlled despite obvious terror driving them toward panic. Marcus counted them as they passed. 10 inmates, all moving with discipline that seemed almost miraculous given the circumstances. The smoke thickened continuously, dropping lower each minute. His calculations suggested they had perhaps 8 minutes before oxygen depletion made consciousness unsustainable. Cells 11 through 20, you're next, Marcus called out. His throat felt raw, each word scraping against smoke-damaged tissue. Same protocol. Walk, stay right, keep moving. What about the guard? Thompson appeared at Marcus's shoulder, his weathered face grim in the emergency lighting. Davis looks bad, real bad. Marcus glanced toward the guard station where Davis had collapsed. The bleeding seemed to have slowed, but his breathing had become irregular. Short gasps interspersed with longer pauses that suggested respiratory systems struggling against smoke and shock. Moving him required care that conflicted with the evacuation speed. We'll get him, Marcus said, making the decision without time for deeper analysis. But we need clear corridors first. Can't navigate with 40 people trying to evacuate simultaneously. Thompson nodded, understanding the brutal mathematics involved. I'll stay with you. Help carry him when the time comes. The offer surprised Marcus. Thompson possessed no obvious motivation for risking additional exposure to smoke and fire. Their previous interactions had been minimal. The professional distance inmates maintained to survive psychologically challenging incarceration. Yet here stood Thompson, volunteering to delay his own evacuation for someone else's survival. Cells 21 through 30, Marcus continued the structured evacuation. Your turn, same rules apply. The corridor began clearing as inmates evacuated in ordered groups. Some threw grateful glances toward Marcus as they passed. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Their focus narrowed to the emergency exit and the promise of safety beyond D-Block's compromised structure. A few muttered thanks that Marcus barely registered above the alarm's persistent wail. At the 35 inmate mark, the building groaned with new intensity. The sound originated from below, a deep rumbling that suggested major structural failure. The floor trembled slightly, and somewhere distant, another massive collapse sent vibrations through the concrete walls. "We need to move faster," Jackson said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "This whole place is coming down." "Stick to the plan," Marcus insisted, though his own assessment matched Jackson's concern. The prison's structural integrity was failing faster than anticipated. His 8-minute estimate might have been optimistic. "Cells 31 through 40, go now. Quick but controlled." The remaining inmates moved toward the exit with speed that bordered on running, but maintained just enough discipline to avoid becoming a stampede. Marcus watched them disappear into the smoke-filled stairwell, counting heads to ensure everyone had evacuated their assigned cells. 43, 44, 45, 46. That left Marcus, Thompson, Davis, and one unaccounted inmate. Marcus did a rapid mental inventory of cells, trying to identify who hadn't passed through the evacuation. The smoke made visibility nearly impossible now, emergency lighting barely penetrating the toxic haze filling D-Block from ceiling to chest height. "Cell 47, Thompson said, pointing toward Marcus's former cell. "Someone's still in there." Marcus moved toward his cell, confusion mixing with concern. He'd opened all the cells simultaneously. Everyone should have evacuated, unless someone had remained inside voluntarily, which made no sense given the circumstances, or unless someone had collapsed from smoke inhalation before they could exit. Through the open door of cell D47, Marcus saw a figure slumped on his bunk. Young, probably early 20s, someone Marcus recognized but couldn't immediately name. One of the newer inmates who'd arrived within the past few months and kept to himself with the careful paranoia of someone still adjusting to incarceration. The kid wasn't moving, no one left behind. In our darkest moments, we discover who we truly are, not who we claim to be, but who our actions prove us to be. One man faced a decision that would cost him everything or define his legacy forever. Would you turn back into danger for someone you barely knew? Share this story if you believe in the power of redemption. This chapter will test your faith in humanity. Marcus entered cell D47, his own cell, the space he'd occupied for 7 years, 3 months, and 14 days, and immediately understood the situation's severity. The young inmate lay collapsed on the narrow bunk, his breathing shallow and rapid. Smoke inhalation had incapacitated him before he could evacuate, or perhaps panic had frozen his response system entirely. "Hey," Marcus shook the kid's shoulder firmly. "Time to move. We're leaving, now." No response. The kid's eyes remained closed, his body unresponsive beyond the chest movements indicating continued breathing. Unconscious or semi-conscious, the distinction mattered less than the immediate need to evacuate him before the smoke dropped to floor level and made breathing impossible even for those still conscious. Thompson appeared in the doorway. "He's out?" "Mostly," Marcus confirmed. He assessed the kid's build, maybe 160 pounds, medium height, manageable carry for a single person, but easier with two. "Help me get him up." They lifted the unconscious inmate with practiced efficiency born from years of manual labor. Marcus took the shoulders, Thompson grabbed the legs, and together they maneuvered out of the cell into the corridor where smoke had thickened to the point that visibility extended only a few feet in any direction. Davis remained slumped against the guard station, his breathing worse than before. The guard's eyes tracked their movement with dim awareness, enough consciousness to recognize help approaching, not enough to participate in his own rescue. "Set him down," Marcus instructed Thompson. They lowered the unconscious kid carefully against the corridor wall, positioning him where smoke levels remained slightly lower. "I'll get Davis. You make sure this one keeps breathing." Thompson nodded, already checking the kid's airway and positioning his head to maintain clear breathing passage. The older inmate's movements carried competence that suggested either medical training or hard-earned experience with emergency situations. Marcus moved to Davis, kneeling beside the injured guard. Up close, the damage appeared worse than initially visible. The gash on his forehead continued bleeding sluggishly, but more concerning was the blood at the corners of his mouth and the irregular breathing pattern suggesting internal injuries beyond basic smoke inhalation. "Davis," Marcus said clearly, hoping to penetrate the guard's shock-clouded consciousness. "I'm going to carry you out. This is going to hurt. I'm sorry." The guard's eyes focused briefly on Marcus's face. Recognition flickered in their depths. Not just identification of Marcus as an individual, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps. Or maybe regret for his earlier declaration about divine abandonment. "Told you. God forgot." Davis wheezed, his lips pulling into something that might have been a smile if circumstances had been different. "Then it's good I didn't listen," Marcus replied, positioning himself to lift the guard in a fireman's carry. The technique required significant strength and balance, especially while navigating through smoke-filled corridors with compromised breathing. But alternative options had evaporated with each minute of structural deterioration. He lifted Davis across his shoulders, feeling his legs protest the additional weight. The guard groaned, a sound that confirmed continued consciousness despite severe injuries. Marcus straightened slowly, adjusting his balance before attempting to move toward the emergency exit. "Thompson," Marcus called through the smoke. "Can you handle the kid?" "Already on it," Thompson responded. Through the haze, Marcus saw the older inmate lifting the unconscious young man in a similar carry. The image struck him with unexpected force. Two inmates risking everything to save people who represented their captivity and their own kind respectively. Humanity transcending institutional roles in the face of shared mortality. They moved toward the emergency exit with agonizing slowness. Each step required conscious balance, careful foot placement, and maintained awareness of the increasingly hostile environment. The smoke had dropped to waist level now, transforming the corridor into a tunnel of toxic gas that burned lungs and eyes with chemical intensity. The building groaned again, a sound that seemed to come from the prison's very foundation. The floor trembled more violently this time, and Marcus heard the distinctive crack of concrete failing under stress. Somewhere in the structure's lower levels, major support elements were giving way to heat and fire damage. "Keep moving," Marcus said unnecessarily. Thompson needed no encouragement, his pace matching Marcus's urgent but controlled progression towards safety. The emergency exit appeared through the smoke like a beacon, red lighting illuminating the stairwell access that represented their only escape route from D Block. Marcus could see the doorway clearly now, could visualize the descent through stairwells to ground level and the fresh air waiting beyond the prison's compromised shell. 15 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet. An explosion erupted from below with force that transformed the floor into a bucking platform. Not a directed blast, but a sudden structural failure. Some critical support or fuel source finally succumbing to the fire's sustained assault. The shockwave traveled upward through the building's concrete skeleton, and Marcus felt his balance disappear as the floor shifted beneath his feet. He fell, Davis's weight driving him downward. His head struck concrete with sharp impact that filled his vision with stars. Pain radiated outward from multiple points of contact: skull, shoulder, hip, knee. The keys he'd been clutching scattered across the floor with metallic ringing that seemed absurdly loud above the chaos. Through blurred vision, Marcus saw Thompson stumble but maintain his footing, the unconscious kid still secured across his shoulders. The older inmate looked back, his face grim with decision. Marcus understood before Thompson spoke. "I'll get help," Thompson said. "I'll send them back for you." The emergency exit door closed behind Thompson with a soft click that sounded like finality. Divine memories. Sometimes we find God not in answered prayers, but in unanswered moments where faith faces its ultimate test. One man lay dying, discovering that divine memory worked differently than human expectation. Not abandonment, but preparation. Have you ever felt forgotten, only to realize you were being positioned? Keep reading, and if this story moves you, leave a comment about your own moment of unexpected grace. Marcus lay on the cold concrete floor, Davis's weight pressing against his injured side, and understood with crystalline clarity that he might die up in this corridor. The realization carried no panic, just calm acceptance that surprised him given the circumstances. 7 years of reading the same Bible passages had prepared him for mortality's arrival, though he'd imagined it differently. Quietly, perhaps. Peacefully. Not in smoke and fire while carrying a guard who'd declared God had forgotten him. The irony seemed almost literary. Divine comedy written in institutional tragedy. Davis stirred, his consciousness fluctuating in patterns that suggested severe trauma. His lips moved, forming words that emerged too quietly for Marcus to hear above the alarm's persistent wail. Marcus shifted, ignoring fresh pain from his collision with the floor, positioning himself to better understand whatever the guard was trying to communicate. "Sorry," Davis wheezed. "Didn't mean what I said." The apology drifted between them like the smoke filling the corridor. Marcus wanted to say something profound, to offer forgiveness with theological grace that would provide comfort in potentially final moments. But his smoke-damaged lungs could barely manage breathing, let alone philosophical discourse. "Doesn't matter," Marcus managed, the words scraping out. "Water under the bridge." "No," Davis insisted with surprising force. Blood appeared at the corner of his mouth again, suggesting internal bleeding that medical intervention needed to address urgently, if medical intervention ever arrived. "Does matter. Told you. God forgot you. But look what you did." Marcus understood the guard's meaning. In declaring divine abandonment, Davis had articulated his own faithlessness, his belief that justice and mercy existed as human constructs rather than universal principles. But Marcus's actions during the crisis had demonstrated something different. Selflessness without expectation of reward. Sacrifice without calculating personal cost. Love, if one could use such a word in a prison context, for people who'd shown him no particular kindness. "Maybe God remembers differently than we think," Marcus said, echoing his earlier response to Davis's theological challenge. The statement felt more substantial now, weighted with experience rather than hollow philosophy. Maybe divine memory isn't about individuals feeling noticed. Maybe it's about being positioned where you're needed when everything falls apart. The concept seemed to offer Davis some comfort. His breathing eased slightly, still labored, still concerning, but perhaps less agonized. Or maybe Marcus was projecting hope onto deteriorating medical reality. The smoke continued dropping, now reaching floor level in wispy tendrils that promised complete saturation within minutes. Marcus's calculations about oxygen depletion had proven accurate if overly optimistic. They had perhaps 3 minutes before consciousness became unsustainable. 3 minutes for rescue that might never arrive. He thought about his nephew, the 7-year-old boy in the photograph marking his place in Proverbs. 14 years old now, assuming time had continued outside these walls. A young man who'd grown up without his uncle's presence, shaped by absence rather than guidance. Marcus had imagined eventual reunion, awkward conversations bridging years of separation, the difficult work of rebuilding relationship damaged by incarceration. That future evaporated in the smoke like everything else. Marcus rejected the resignation, the passive acceptance of death as an inevitable conclusion. Thompson had promised to send help. The older inmate had carried the unconscious kid to safety and would alert emergency responders that 2 people remained trapped in D block. Rescue remained possible if structural collapse didn't arrive before firefighters. But believing rescue would arrive required something Marcus had struggled with throughout his incarceration. Faith in systems, in people, in the fundamental benevolence of a universe that often seemed determinedly indifferent to individual survival. "Davis," Marcus said, shaking the guard's shoulder. "Stay with me. Help is coming." Thompson went to get emergency crews. "They'll be here." "How do you know?" Davis asked, his voice barely audible. "How can you trust that?" The question contained depths neither of them had energy to explore. Trust, the foundation of all functional human systems, had eroded for both men through different mechanisms. Davis through years of witnessing institutional failure and human cruelty. Marcus through years of experiencing justice as punishment without rehabilitation, confinement without purpose. Yet here Marcus lay, injured and smoke damage, still believing rescue would arrive, still maintaining faith in systems that had confined him, in people who declared him forgotten, in divine memory that operated outside human perception. Because Thompson gave his word, Marcus answered simply. And right now, that's enough. The floor trembled again, smaller this time, but suggesting continued structural deterioration. Marcus heard new sounds through the smoke, distant voices shouting, boots on concrete, the organized chaos of emergency response. Or maybe he was hallucinating, his oxygen-starved brain creating auditory fantasies to provide comfort in final moments. Then through the haze, Marcus saw shapes moving toward them, figures wearing firefighting gear, carrying equipment, their flashlight beams cutting through smoke like searchlights. Real, solid, undeniably present. Thompson hadn't just sent help, he'd led them back personally, guiding firefighters through the compromised building to locate the two people remaining in D Block. Over here! Thompson's voice cut through Marcus's fading awareness. Two down! Guards injured bad. Webb took a hit when the floor shifted. Strong hands lifted Marcus. Professional voices assessed his condition with efficient medical terminology, and someone placed an oxygen mask over his face. The cool flow of clean air struck him like salvation itself, immediate, overwhelming, transformative. He breathed deeply, feeling consciousness sharpen as oxygen reached his compromised system. Through the mask's clear plastic, Marcus watched firefighters work on Davis with practiced urgency. They'd brought a stretcher, had established airway, were addressing the guard's injuries with competence born from extensive training. Davis would survive. They'd all survived. As emergency responders carried them toward the exit, Marcus's gaze found the spot where the keys had scattered after his fall. The metal ring lay abandoned on the concrete floor, the instrument of salvation now just another piece of debris in the fire-damaged corridor. Someone would collect them later, would catalog them in evidence reports, would note them as the keys that had opened 47 cells and saved 49 people, including the man who'd declared God's forgetting and the man who'd proved divine memory operated outside human understanding. Aftermath. Recovery reveals character more honestly than crisis ever could. One man woke in a hospital bed to discover his actions had rewritten his story and challenged everyone's assumptions about redemption. What happens when the forgotten become unforgettable? Stay till the end and don't forget to like this video if you believe second chances should be more than empty promises. Marcus regained full consciousness 17 hours after emergency responders evacuated him from D Block. The hospital room materialized gradually through medication-induced fog, white walls, monitoring equipment beeping rhythmically, afternoon sunlight filtering through blinds that cast linear shadows across clean linens. His throat felt raw. His shoulder throbbed where he'd contorted it through cell bars. Multiple abrasions marked his arms and legs, souvenirs from his collision with the concrete floor. But he breathed easily, the oxygen mask replaced by a nasal cannula delivering supplemental flow. And the fact of breathing at all seemed miraculous given the circumstances he dimly remembered. "You're awake." The voice belonged to a woman Marcus didn't recognize. Mid-40s, professional demeanor, clothing suggesting medical authority, though she wore no visible hospital identification. "I'm Dr. Ramirez. How are you feeling?" Marcus tested his voice cautiously. "Like I went through a fire." Technically accurate, Dr. Ramirez smiled slightly, checking monitors with practiced efficiency. "You have smoke inhalation, multiple contusions, and a minor concussion from your fall. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to keep you here for observation. You were very lucky." Lucky seemed an interesting word choice. Marcus thought about the sequence of events leading to this hospital bed. The fire, the abandoned keys, the evacuation. The choice to turn back for Davis and the unconscious kid. Luck implied randomness, chance events converging favorably. But his survival had required conscious decisions at multiple junctures. "The others?" Marcus asked. His memory remained hazy about final moments before rescue arrived. "Davis? The kid from my cell? Thompson?" "Everyone survived," Dr. Ramirez assured him. "Guard Davis sustained serious injuries and required surgery, but he's stable now. The young inmate, Rodriguez, had severe smoke inhalation but responded well to treatment, and Thompson walked away with minimal injuries beyond what you'd expect from smoke exposure." Marcus absorbed this information with quiet relief. The mathematics of survival had worked. Structured evacuation, controlled panic, willingness to delay personal safety for collective welfare. All the principles he'd employed instinctively during crisis had produced outcomes that might have seemed impossible given the circumstances. There are people who want to see you, Dr. Archfris continued. Prison officials, reporters, even the governor's office has made inquiries. You've become something of a, well, I suppose the word is hero, though I understand that label might be complicated given your situation. Hero. The term felt alien applied to Marcus Webb, inmate D47, convicted 7 years ago for crimes that had seemed to define his identity throughout his incarceration. Heroes existed in stories, in movies, in carefully constructed narratives that portrayed clear distinctions between good and evil. They didn't exist in prison cells, didn't wear institutional orange, didn't carry the label of criminal alongside whatever redemptive actions crisis might have precipitated. I'd like to see Thompson first, Marcus said. Among everyone who might want to speak with him, Thompson understood the complexity of what had happened. The older inmate had made similar choices during the evacuation, delaying his own escape to help carry the unconscious Rodriguez, returning to guide firefighters back to Marcus and Davis despite having reached safety. I'll see what I can arrange, Dr. Archfris said. She paused at the door, her professional demeanor softening slightly. What you did in that prison, it mattered. Not just the lives saved, but what it represented. People need to see that kind of courage, especially from unexpected sources. After she left, Marcus lay in the hospital bed contemplating unexpected sources. His entire life had been unexpected in various ways. Unexpected talent for leadership that emerged during crisis, unexpected capacity for selflessness when self-preservation should have dominated, unexpected faith that survived even when divine memory seemed absent. The door opened again an hour later, and Thompson entered accompanied by a correctional officer who positioned himself discreetly near the doorway. The older inmate looked tired but healthy, his gray hair freshly cut, his prison uniform replaced by hospital-issued clothing similar to what Marcus wore. You look terrible, Thompson said by way of greeting, pulling a chair close to Marcus's bed, like you carried a guard through a burning building. Funny, Marcus replied, managing a weak smile. You look pretty good for someone who carried Rodriguez and then ran back into that mess to find us. Thompson waved away the comment. Someone had to make sure you didn't die in there. After everything you did, getting everyone out would have been a waste if you didn't make it. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Two men who'd shared extraordinary circumstances but possessed no previous relationship beyond casual institutional proximity. Yet the crisis had created bonds that transcended normal social development, accelerating connection through shared mortality and mutual sacrifice. They're talking about early release, Thompson said eventually, for both of us. Heroism during emergency situations, lives saved, demonstrated rehabilitation. The whole package that makes politicians look good when they sign clemency papers. Early release. The concept seemed abstract, disconnected from reality, despite being the precise outcome Marcus had hoped for throughout his incarceration. Freedom had existed as distant possibility, something to work toward through good behavior and completed programs. Now it arrived as direct consequence of actions taken during the single most dangerous night of his life. How do you feel about that? Marcus asked. Thompson considered the question carefully. Grateful, terrified, uncertain I deserve it more than guys who've been inside longer without getting chance to be heroes. He met Marcus's gaze directly. How do you feel about it? Marcus didn't have a simple answer. His nephew existed somewhere in the world, 14 years old now, a young man who might not want relationship with an uncle whose criminal record complicated family dynamics. His previous life, the career, the apartment, the routine, had evaporated during incarceration. Early release meant rebuilding everything from scratch with the added burden of being labeled both hero and convict simultaneously. I feel like divine memory worked exactly as it should, Marcus said finally. Not the way I expected. Not comfortable or easy, but precisely how it needed to work to put me where I could help when help mattered most. Thompson nodded slowly. Davis told me what he said to you, about God forgetting. He wants to apologize personally when he's recovered enough. Already did, Marcus replied, right before the firefighters arrived. but I'll accept another apology if it helps him. Sometimes people need to say things multiple times before they believe their own words matter. The correctional officer near the door cleared his throat, a polite signal that visiting time was ending. Thompson stood but hesitated before leaving. Whatever happens next, Thompson said, whatever early release or press conferences or political theater they put us through, remember we didn't do it for any of that. We did it because it was right. That's all that matters. Remembered ever ending creates a beginning, and every life can become a testimony that transcends individual circumstance. One man discovered that being forgotten by people meant nothing compared to being remembered by purpose. This final chapter reveals how one night transformed not just survivors, but everyone who heard their story. Subscribe for more stories that prove redemption is always possible. Share this if someone needs to hear that their worst moments don't define their ultimate worth. 3 months after the fire, Marcus stood outside the prison gates wearing donated civilian clothes and carrying a small bag containing his few possessions. Early release had been processed with bureaucratic efficiency, paperwork signed, conditions established, monitoring protocols explained. He was free, though freedom carried asterisks and qualifications that would persist for years. A car waited near the gate, not a taxi or ride service, but a personal vehicle driven by someone Marcus recognized from newspaper photographs. Davis, the guard who'd declared God had forgotten Marcus, now served as his escort back into society. Figured you could use a ride, Davis said as Marcus approached. The guard, former guard, technically, since his injuries had resulted in medical retirement, looked healthier than during their last encounter. The gash on his forehead had healed into a thin scar, and his movements suggested recovery from internal injuries, though he still moved carefully. Appreciate it, Marcus replied, setting his bag in the back seat before settling into the passenger side. The car's interior smelled of coffee and pine air freshener, mundane details that seemed remarkable after years of institutional sameness. They drove in silence through streets Marcus barely recognized. 3 months wasn't long enough for fundamental urban transformation, but his perception had changed enough that familiar landmarks appeared foreign. The world outside had continued without him, had adapted and evolved while he'd existed in temporal suspension behind concrete walls. They're doing a ceremony, Davis said eventually. Governor wants to present commendations. Press will be there. They asked me to convince you to attend. Marcus had received multiple requests about the ceremony through his parole officer. Official recognition for actions during the fire, public acknowledgement of heroism under extraordinary circumstances, political optics that portrayed the criminal justice system as producing rehabilitation success stories. He declined every invitation. Not interested in being a political prop, Marcus said. Fair enough, Davis nodded, though I think you're missing the point. It's not about politicians looking good. It's about people seeing that redemption exists, that past mistakes don't define future character. The statement carried weight coming from Davis, someone who'd experienced Marcus's redemptive action firsthand rather than reading about it in sanitized press releases. But Marcus remained uncomfortable with hero worship that ignored complexity in favor of simple narrative. What happened that night wasn't redemption, Marcus said carefully. It was just what needed doing. Anyone would have done the same. Except they wouldn't have, Davis countered. I've worked prisons for 23 years, seen every kind of crisis. And I'm telling you what you did, the structured evacuation, the risk you took going back for me and Rodriguez, that wasn't normal behavior. That was exceptional. They pulled into a parking lot near a community center where the ceremony was being held. Through the building's windows, Marcus could see people gathering, officials, reporters, camera crews, the machinery of public recognition warming up to process his story into digestible media content. I told them I wouldn't attend, Marcus said, making no move to exit the vehicle. I know, Davis replied, but Thompson's in there. Rodriguez, too. They came to honor what you did for them. Least you could do is show up. The appeal to personal connection rather than political theater shifted Marcus's resistance slightly. Thompson had written to him during the 3 months before release, describing his own adjustment to freedom and the challenges of rebuilding life with a criminal record. Rodriguez had sent a simple thank you note, brief, awkward, but carrying genuine gratitude. Marcus exited the car. Inside the community center, the ceremony unfolded with predictable formality: speeches from officials, media coverage, presentations of plaques and certificates. The governor praised Marcus's courage and character, using his story as evidence that rehabilitation programming worked. Prison administrators highlighted institutional improvements implemented after the fire. Reporters documented everything for evening news segments. Through it all, Marcus stood uncomfortably in donated suit, accepting recognition while maintaining internal distance from the heroic narrative being constructed around his actions. He'd saved lives. That mattered. But the ceremony spectacle felt disconnected from the desperate reality of that night. The smoke, the fear, the impossible choices made in circumstances where hesitation meant death.
"I wanted to thank you," Rodriguez said quietly, his voice carrying an accent that suggested Spanish as his first language. "The doctors said I would have died if you hadn't come back. Everyone had evacuated. You were free. But you came back." Marcus saw tears forming in the kid's eyes and understood that this, not the ceremony, not the political theater, but this moment of genuine human connection, represented the actual meaning behind his actions. He'd saved this specific life, given this young man additional time to become whoever he was meant to become. "I'm glad you're okay," Marcus said, the words insufficient but sincere. "I'm going to be better than okay," Rodriguez promised. "I'm going to live like someone who got a second chance, like someone who mattered enough that a stranger risked his life." He paused, searching for words. "I'm going to make your sacrifice mean something." After Rodriguez moved away, Thompson appeared with 2 cups of coffee. The older man handed one to Marcus with a slight smile. "Overwhelming, isn't it?" Thompson observed. "All this attention for doing what any decent person would do." "You said it yourself," Marcus replied. "Most people wouldn't have done it. That's what makes it worth celebrating, apparently." They watched the ceremony's attendees networking and socializing, politicians mixing with media, officials congratulating each other on successful rehabilitation programming, the machinery of bureaucracy processing their story into institutional success metrics. "Davis told me what he said to you," Thompson mentioned, "about God forgetting. You ever figure out your response to that?" Marcus considered the question while sipping coffee that tasted remarkable after years of institutional variations on the theme of brown liquid. The theological challenge Davis had posed, divine memory versus human suffering, cosmic justice versus observed reality, had seemed insoluble during his incarceration. But the fire had provided unexpected clarity. "I think God's memory works through positioning," Marcus said slowly, developing the concept as he spoke. "Not divine intervention saving us from consequences, but divine preparation putting us where we're needed when everything falls apart. Davis thought God forgot me, but maybe God remembered me exactly when and where it mattered. Gave me 7 years of experience with that prison's layout, with managing people under stress, with maintaining calm during chaos. Then orchestrated circumstances where those specific skills became the difference between 49 people living or dying." Thompson listened thoughtfully. "That's either profound theology or elaborate rationalization." "Maybe both," Marcus admitted. "Maybe that's what faith requires, believing that apparent abandonment is actually preparation. That the universe hasn't forgotten you. It's positioning you." The ceremony concluded with final photographs. Marcus standing with Davis, with Rodriguez, with Thompson. Visual documentation of survival and redemption that would circulate through media outlets, become attached to stories about criminal justice reform and rehabilitation success. His face would become familiar to thousands of people who knew nothing about him beyond the hero narrative. As they prepared to leave, Marcus noticed his nephew standing near the community center's entrance, 14 years old, wearing clothes too trendy for Marcus to identify, his face carrying features that echoed Marcus's own younger appearance. The boy who'd never responded to letters. The family connection severed by incarceration and shame. They stared at each other across the crowded room. Uncle and nephew separated by years and circumstance, connected by blood and the possibility that redemptive action might rebuild what crime had damaged. The nephew moved first, crossing the distance with teenagers' awkward self-consciousness. He stopped a few feet away, hands in pockets, uncertainty clear in his posture. My mom said I should come, the kid said by way of greeting. Said you saved a bunch of people. That you were different than before. Marcus searched for appropriate response. 7 years of imagining this conversation hadn't prepared him for the reality of facing his nephew as both hero and convict, both redeemed and marked by past failures. I'm the same person, Marcus said honestly. Just had a chance to prove something to myself about who I wanted to be. The guard said you carried him out while you could have left him, his nephew continued. Said you opened everyone's cells even though you could have just saved yourself. Yeah, Marcus confirmed. That's what happened. The kid nodded slowly, processing information that conflicted with whatever narrative he'd constructed about his incarcerated uncle. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A genuine expression that transformed his features from guarded uncertainty to something approaching acceptance. That's pretty cool, he said. Maybe we could get coffee sometime? You could tell me about it. If you want. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not quite tears, but emotional recognition that redemption existed in small moments as much as dramatic gestures. In nephews offering coffee, in guards providing rides, in young inmates promising to honor second chances. I'd like that, Marcus replied. I'd like that very much. As they left the community center together, Marcus, Davis, Thompson, Rodriguez, and his nephew. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. The prison fire had occurred 3 months ago, but its consequences rippled outward in ways that transcended the immediate crisis. Lives saved, relationships restored, faith vindicated through action rather than empty promises. Davis had declared God had forgotten Marcus, but standing in afternoon sunlight surrounded by people whose survival depended on his remembered purpose, Marcus understood divine memory had worked perfectly, not through comfort or ease, but through positioning someone with necessary skills in the precise location where those skills would save 49 lives. He had been forgotten by institutional systems, overlooked by society, dismissed by guards who saw only inmate numbers rather than human potential. But divine memory, the universal principle that positioned people where they were needed, had remembered Marcus Webb exactly when his remembering mattered most. The fire had proven that no one is forgotten. Not really. They're simply waiting for the moment when their specific purpose becomes undeniable, when their particular combination of experience and character creates outcomes that transform crisis into testimony. Marcus looked at his nephew, at Davis, at Thompson, at Rodriguez, and understood that his story wasn't about a single heroic night. It was about preparation meeting opportunity, about 7 years of discipline and self-reflection creating capacity for selfless action, about faith sustained through apparent abandonment until the moment when that faith became action that saved lives. God hadn't forgotten him. God had been preparing him, positioning him, remembering him with the kind of memory that transcends human perception, the memory that sees endings as beginnings and views apparent failure as groundwork for transformation. And now, walking into afternoon sunlight with people whose lives intersected with his through extraordinary circumstances, Marcus finally understood what divine memory actually meant. Being exactly who you need to be, precisely when the world needs you to be it.